Impact Series podcast, in which we share the experiences of social entrepreneurs and change makers around the world. Today, we're going to be talking about the organization Firefly International, which is a nonprofit that supports grassroots projects in post-conflict or conflict-ridden areas to help provide children with a safe and supportive space. I'm Delaney, joined by my co-host Vandana. Today, we are honored to have guest Jeremy Wildeman on our call. Jeremy is a trustee with Firefly International who volunteers on a daily basis supporting the Firefly director to manage, strategize, and fundraise. He has 15 years of experience in teaching and designing education projects, conducting research in international affairs, and running humanitarian and development aid projects in conflict. How are you, Jeremy?
Good. How are you doing?
Well.
Great. So can you share with us the story of Firefly's founding and mission?
Yeah, it has almost a two-part founding, we can say. It began in 1998 when our founder, Ellie Maxwell, was in Bosnia during the conflict there while her father was a peacekeeper. And she established what was called at the time the Firefly Youth Project, which later became two organizations, Svitash, which is now in Brčko, Bosnia, and Firefly International, which is our British charity. Now during that, I'm going to go back to her experience. When she was there, she was an aid worker in Bosnia, and through her experiences, she came to believe that shared creative activities and contact with the outside world play an important role in reducing tensions in what was a very sectarian, violent conflict. So after the war, Ellie continued that work with music, arts, language classes, and various activities for children in refugee camps. This was in, at the time, Croatia and Bosnia, as the borders were a bit more fluid. And eventually, over time, it became a more established sort of project in a town called Brčko in the northeast of Bosnia. And it's a very special town in the sense that it's went back to and retained its very multi-ethnic character in Bosnia, reflecting what Yugoslavia once was. And Firefly and Svitash, particularly the Bosnian charity that came out of this, has played a really important role in continuing to reinforce that multi-ethnic character in that community. So this is way back in 1998-99 this was happening. Unfortunately, about 10 years later, Ellie Maxwell died early of cancer. And what happened was, rather than sort of allowing the charity to just continue, maybe to even peter out and not be able to support the partner in Bosnia, people such as myself and some of her family and friends became more involved and sort of worked on a redevelopment of Firefly to expand its work to work in more regions. In my case, I founded a charity in the West Bank, city of Nablus, with Palestinian colleagues that is quite a large organization and has very similar structure in the sense of working with youth, development, helping reach out to different communities around the world and internally in the Palestinian territories. And we had partnered with Firefly just as Ellie was getting ill. So I was already connected to the charity and stepped in for a couple of years to help work with the other trustees, after having been a trustee myself briefly, to strengthen Firefly and to expand its work. So we sort of upped our relationship as Firefly with Project Hope in Nablus. This is the charity that I had helped to establish, in order to work with youth there through English classes, French classes. We're supporting all these ongoing activities, creative arts. It's quite a large program there. And since then, we've begun work with Syrian refugees, particularly helping a refugee named Fadia, who's now in Antakya, Turkey, to develop her own youth development center. So our mission as a charity is to support locally led projects in conflict and post-conflict regions that create safe, supportive, and inclusive spaces for young people as we say, to learn, thrive, and grow. And our focus right now is on the three regions I've mentioned, Bosnia, with Palestinians, and with Syrians, refugees. And what's really important for us is we support local leadership. So typically we've gotten involved in regions where we've identified or worked with a local social entrepreneur who wants to provide something for their community, provide something for the youth in their community, and we provided them with resources, organizational know-how, and other means of support to develop their own program, which we then want to see them establish as their own charity that we just help long-term. So local leadership is vital to everything we do.
Wow, that's really an amazing and inspiring story. Your story, especially about taking her idea and like forming something amazing out of it. I think that's incredible. And you've mentioned some of them, but what are some of the other highlights and accomplishments of Firefly, your branch with Palestine, and other branches of Firefly since founding?
I don't know. It's kind of a difficult question to answer, because I feel like there's been so many, considering each region has had its own major accomplishments. They're really hard places to work in their own unique ways. I mean, the main point is, especially with the Palestinian one and the Bosnian one, we've been able to see lives shaped now for almost 20 years in the case of Bosnia, and nearly as long in Palestine with Palestinians. I think the fact that each of the organizations that we've focused on supporting, they've went from not existing to becoming important players in their local communities. In the case of Birchco and Nablus, the organizations we support are two of the most important organizations in their cities. They're really important to the social fabric there. So they support the community and they support the youth there on a massive scale with very modest funding. And we're seeing very positive signs that the same can happen for Syrian refugees in the Turkish city we're supporting them in. I mean, the fact that we were able to help a Palestinian organization to establish itself during the really violent Second Intifada, and all the restrictions on the ground, that's remarkable. In Bosnia, after such a vicious civil war, working between communities, I mean, that's really something quite amazing as well. And it's really not easy to work with Syrian refugees at the moment either. So I guess we like taking on these big challenges and supporting people in the most difficult circumstances, and that's accomplishment to be quite proud of.
Definitely.
Yeah, it's really incredible.
So could you give us a brief overview of the projects Firefly is currently running?
Yeah, and I think it's important to say, even though I don't like to say we're currently running, we're supporting, because we're not running them. Our structure is to support local partners. And the only thing we're running is our own sort of organization in the UK to then support those partners. So our focus right now is on our three major partners in Bosnia, in the West Bank, and in the city of Antakya, the Syrian refugees there. And in each case, they sort of have unique needs. In the case of Bosnia, one of the needs, sort of the situation is that even though it's now almost 20 years since the Civil War and its sort of immediate after effects, the conditions in Bosnia are not great. The economy never really recovered. There is constant ethnic tension in Bosnia, and it's not easy to keep working there. So at the same time, though, there's not a lot of attention paid by donors to a region that just doesn't get a lot of media attention. So one of our major challenges is finding resources for our partner in Bosnia, because it is really much more difficult to find funding for them than for, let's say, Palestinians or Syrians. The other thing we are really supporting them with is they are always looking for international volunteers, and we're really making an effort to encourage Canadians and Americans to volunteer there now with Svitash. It's a very beautiful country, a very great experience, and it's probably the easiest organization to work with of the ones we work with. Now, in the case of Nablus, they're also always recruiting international volunteers, and they have quite a big sort of volunteer program. So they have fewer problems recruiting volunteers because there's a lot of interest in Palestine. They also have a sort of Arabic language program for internationals wanting to learn Arabic on a semi-formal basis, but one-on-one with tutors. We're often helping them to design funding proposals, though, to raise funds for their large program. They work with hundreds of kids every month, and they work with over 60 local partners. So that takes a lot of time. Our having the personnel to help them write complex grant proposals is one of the greater challenges with Project Hope. Then we are really focused on raising funds for the refugees in Antakya. There's just so many refugees, and the program there is fantastic. Fadi has developed some amazing science programs that I wish I had had growing up in rural Canada, like learning about DNA and just creative means of learning maths. They've got a lot of talent there and ideas for programs. Really, the main thing we're supporting them with to work with the youth there is funding. So, and that's a lot of work. A lot of overall, between all the partners, often what they most need is funding and to a certain extent volunteers. In the case of the Syrian case, we don't recruit volunteers. I'll just add too, in the case of the Syrian refugees, they are targeting a specific community, and this is children who have to work and who are not living in refugee camps, but just living in the city, so they don't have access to the same programs that refugees have. So life is not great as a refugee. It's probably maybe even tougher for the children living in cities who are then forced to work. Many of them have missed education for several years now. Their families, they're in an emergency situation. They've needed their children to work to survive, and in many cases they thought the situation would be temporary. Who in Syria would have thought the civil war would drag on like it did? So there's a really acute need to work with these young people. It's like each program is so complex that they have that we could probably spend an hour talking about what each one is doing.
Yeah, definitely. And given your extensive focus in the Middle East and other areas that are kind of, they have complicated relationships with education, can you describe some of the attitudes towards education or the responses you've seen in those communities in the programs you support?
Yeah, they have a voracious hunger for education. I think so many people see school as a way to improve their circumstances. It's and I go back to being a fellow North American. I feel like school has sort of there's not the same sort of fight to be educated amongst youth in North America as there is, as I've seen amongst youth in the Middle East. It's really important to them, really important to their families. So there's sort of an endless demand for anything our partners can support and for us to support our partners. Also, there's a very interesting amongst these youth is an interest in the outside world. Maybe it's common everywhere, but they're very, very interested in being connected to foreigners and seeing other ways of lives and learning about what it's like in other countries. I think it's probably in no small measure due to the restrictions on their own movement and just how difficult their own societies are.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So clearly Firefly focuses in areas that are torn up or affected by major conflicts, and many charities similarly focusing on these areas face really serious difficulties. And we recently came upon an article that discussed like a charity that completely lost contact with the village they were supporting in a conflict-ridden area. So we were wanting to know, has Fireflies have had any similar experiences, and how are they being dealt with, or how were they dealt with?
Yeah, I know by email you'd mentioned something about this village, and I was wondering if it's This is an organization in the UK that we know that had lost contact with the village they were supporting, and we were just chatting internally. I think there's been a number of cases like this. So each has its unique problems of the regions we're working in, and we definitely focus on the most difficult places to work, and often where it's even, because it's so hard to work there, those communities might not even have support from international NGOs wanting to improve lives for people in these conflict and post-conflict regions. In the case of the Syrian refugees we're working with, one of the great challenges is the fluidity, and that is there's a constant movement of people from region to region. So the children are constantly moving, the people are constantly moving. It can be very difficult to support a program in one spot due to this movement, and also dealing with the numbers of people coming in. Anything for Syrian refugees too, there is a host government that will have its own unique relationship to them, or its own unique, our own sort of, their own challenges to work with as a government. So in the case of Syrian refugees in Turkey, it's been a very challenging political time in Turkey as well, with the coup that happened just last year, and the sort of suspicion around foreign NGOs and the legitimate concerns about caution and security by the Turkish government of people working with refugees. So those can be very difficult to work with. If we wanted to work in Syria, I mean, we really can't. It's very challenging, dangerous. We could maybe support a group working there, but for now we focus on the refugees on the outside. In the case of the Palestinians, there are really extreme Israeli rules and restrictions on movement, and there can be a real hostility towards foreigners who are showing support for Palestinians. So that is quite a challenging place to work on its own too. In the case of Bosnia, there's a lot fewer restrictions. That's probably the easier place to work in, but there are quite a few local government sort of administrative issues that make work challenging there. There's a lot of administration. It's very admin heavy.
Yeah, definitely. And in these areas that are hard to reach, like on their own, how do you guys measure impact, and do you use certain metric or tools to quantify and evaluate your impact when it's even hard to get to the area you're supporting?
Yeah, this is quite a challenge for anybody working in development work, and that is the reporting that you need to show to your donors that they've been funding something, and also to, in our case, the UK government, just for regulatory measures. They keep track of what you're doing as a charity. In our case, we're registered with the Scottish government, the Scottish regional government. Well, and it also this is really this is actually one of the biggest challenges in this field of work, because you need to somehow show that you're having an impact.
Yeah.
And convince your donors or potential donors to fund what's happening. You have to make it look like you have to convey the importance of your program and what your colleagues are doing. The other point is that locally, in our case, in Bosnia or with Palestinians or with Syrians, you have to convey upon them and sort of train them in how to record that data and show why it's important. And this is a constant struggle. It's really, really hard. Boring and hard at the same time. We help keep a lot of quantitative data that is reasonably easy. So numbers to show how many kids have been in a certain activity, or how many activities are taking place, or which towns you've worked in. This has been relatively easy off and on over the years. We find it very easy in Bosnia, maybe because there's such a administrative culture left over from when it was communist. The most challenging with our Palestinian partners, who you really have to struggle with constantly to get data, and it's a common problem in the city we're working in amongst NGOs in Nablus. The other point is that, and I can say this as a researcher, is that the qualitative data is what really matters. And this is not just the numbers, but the experiences or the impact that programs like this have on youth. It's very difficult to measure. You can always argue about what measurement is the most useful. And I say this as a researcher at a major UK university working on development topics. It's especially hard also for a charity with limited resources and charities that are always stretched thin by demand to be active, not to be recording their data. How do you show the impact of your program, maybe psychologically, developmentally, on youth? Also, how do you measure it over a short-term span, say 1 to 3 years, like a donor often gives you money, rather than what's really important, 10, 20, 30 years of a young person's life, and how they develop as an adult. We try, we do our best, and sort of one of the innovations we came up with then is to have as many sort of narrative reports as we can to complement the numbers, so describe the experiences of people, and to capitalize on social media to sort of act as a window on what's happening in each of the regions, to show the impact of the programs that our partners are running. But
Yeah,
it's a constant struggle.
I'm sure. So as you look into the future, where do you see Firefly 5 or 10 years from now?
In the short term, we're working with a Canadian partner called Alternatives, with whom we would like to help more Syrians to develop centers in the Middle East for youth, similar to what we've been supporting in Antakya. So we're working with them out of Canada and trying to find funding for maybe a series of 5 to 10 centers. That'd be quite a great project if it could take off. Long term, in general, we would like to see ourselves still working with our existing partners, sharing their journey with them, and ideally working with several more partners. Because we spend so much time working with each partner and developing helping them develop as an organization, we can only take on so many at a time, and it's very intensive work, but we would like to see ourselves working with more people in similar circumstances in conflict and post-conflict regions in the world, maybe even outside of the Southwest Asia, Middle East, Near East, however we want to call the regions.
Yeah. And so you mentioned earlier that some of the projects you support take volunteers. What are some ways like that people can get involved with Firefly and just help you guys help other people?
Yeah, there's fantastic volunteer experiences both with our Bosnian and Palestinian partners. They're two of the most advanced organizations to volunteer within their respective regions. Their websites can be found through our website, and they manage all the volunteer recruitment. We support them in that, but we've helped them to take over the entire sort of management of volunteers themselves. I would say that the Bosnian one is a little bit more simple to go and volunteer at. The Palestinian one is more sort of a live experience as we are seeing that the conflict there still ongoing. In each case, it's really important to remark that it's a very rich experience for the people who volunteer themselves. I mean, you often learn so much. It's tough to gauge if you're able to give back as much as you're able to learn yourself, but overall it's a very rich experience for everyone involved. And in the cases of these partners, they really appreciate that interaction with foreigners and that sharing of experiences. And it also helps contextually with regions that are experiencing difficulties of conflict based on identity. In the case of the Syrian refugees, we don't, for various reasons at the moment, have any means to help people to volunteer. You can find our partners on our own website, which is fireflyinternational.org, and each one, it's very easy to look up how to volunteer.
That's great. Your story was really inspiring, and we're so thankful that you could join us today for our Impact Series podcast. We look forward to seeing the developments of Firefly in the years to come.